In the mid-1800s and late 1800s, Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, was also making his mark on the field. Like Darwin, Galton was also born into a wealthy English family. He was said to be brilliant, curious, and obsessed with measurement. Galton had many different interests. One of the reasons he ends up in our class is because he is the founder of psychometrics. He also was one of the first people to recognize that the relationship between two variables could be represented with a mathematical equation. Eventually, his mathematical equation would become Pearson's R correlation. Galton was also a sociologist, anthropologist, geographer, inventor, and meteorologist. He explored the African continent, published a very popular travel guide, studied weather and created the first weather maps, and he demonstrated the uniqueness of fingerprints. One of the first individual differences that he measured was intelligence. He believed that intelligence was an ability that we inherit from our parents, and this ability helps us survive and reproduce. He also suggested that the most intelligent humans would rise to the top of society because they are most adapted for their environment. In the 1800s, many people assumed that women were intellectually inferior. Galton reasoned that because of this inferiority, women belonged at the bottom of society. He also argued that biology, that nature, is more important than the environment when it comes to predicting intelligence. Based on these assumptions, he concluded that societies should take steps to improve their genetic material, a process he called eugenics. One way of doing this is to test a large number of people, identify the smartest, most intelligent individuals, and encourage only those individuals to reproduce, to have children. These ideas were very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The eugenics movement lost its appeal after World War II, when the Nazi regime used negative eugenics to discourage ethnic minorities from reproducing. Although these examples at the bottom of the screen were not Galton's original ideas, these are the strategies that came from his eugenics ideas: stigmatization, discrimination, the prevention of marriage, forced sterilization, and forced abortion. His ideas about the eugenics movement are not considered major contributions to psychology, but I wanted to mention them because some of the other early psychologists were also fans of his eugenics ideas. Galton was one of the first scholars to use surveys. In the early 1870s, he constructed a survey and asked 180 elite English colleagues to complete his questionnaire. He asked them about their personality, their physical characteristics, their family characteristics, how they were raised, when they first realized that they had an interest in science, and the nature of that interest. He was trying to figure out whether his rich colleagues had received some type of genetic material from their parents that led them to be interested in science. At this time, he thought that the greatest minds in the world received their abilities, their intelligence from their parents. He surveyed 94 pairs of twins about their personal characteristics and about their upbringing. He found that twins were more similar than non-twins, regardless of whether they were raised in the same household or whether they were raised in separate households. Galton used his results from the surveys and from his twin studies to draw conclusions about intelligence. He believed that his results provided evidence for the heritability of intelligence. Galton gets credit for being the first person to study individual differences using his test of sensory and motor abilities. Now, at this time, we had studied individual differences in animals, but not yet in humans. His test included things like measures of reaction times, auditory and visual thresholds, color naming, judgments of line lengths, and the strength of someone's grip. Eventually, this first test of individual differences becomes Alfred Binet's intelligence test, which is known as the first intelligence test. I want to show you an example of one of the tasks on Galton's original sensory and motor test. Now, this is an adapted version. This is not the original, but I wanted to give you some idea of what Galton was testing in those early days. When I take this test, I can hear at about 125 hertz. Galton believed many of these abilities were correlated with intelligence. Can you think of another reason why some people may be able to hear better than others? Age. Auditory threshold is associated with age. The older we are, the more difficult it is to hear. If you are in your 20s, you are probably able to hear the sound at about 140 hertz. If you are in your 30s, like myself, you probably heard the sound in the 125, 130 range. If you are in your 40s, 50s, 60s, it may not have been until 115 hertz before you could hear the sound. Thanks for joining me to learn more about Galton and Darwin. Next week, in week 6, we will learn more about the pioneers of American psychology.